Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode of Zenography. Today we're going to be looking at SLR film cameras from the 70s and the 80s. Some are consumer cameras, some are professional / semi-professional cameras, some are auto exposure and some are wholly manual exposure, and some have both of those features. And we'll be asking the question, which is the best? So to begin with, we're going to look at this little camera. This was a consumer grade camera from Olympus. It was manufactured from the late 70s until the mid 80s sometime, possibly earlier. And it's the Olympus OM10. Now those of you who watch this channel regularly will know that I am a fan of the Olympus OM cameras, but I've really mostly looked at the OM1s and 2s, which were semi-professional / professional pieces of kit. The OM10 was the consumer grade offering from Olympus, and while in some respects not quite the equal of its more expensive brothers, it's still a very capable camera. One of the great things about the OM10 is that it takes all of the OM system lenses, and if you've seen a couple of my reviews or reviews elsewhere, you will know that these are very, very nice lenses indeed. They're some of the nicest lenses ever made. They're also really small. The OM system in general is a very small system, and the OM10 is no exception to that. This is an aperture priority camera. There is no manual exposure on this camera as it comes out of the box. Now you may think that's a disadvantage, but in practice, whenever I do shoot with a camera that has auto exposure, I pretty much always use aperture priority. So all you do is set your aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed for you. Now aperture is one of the main elements of image control. It's how you control depth of field. So I don't see it really as a problem. There is a little manual adapter that you can buy for these cameras, and it sits on the front here and it slots onto this little point here, and that gives you full manual exposure on this camera. Here's the top deck of the OM10, here's the shutter release, and we've got the film speed setting here. Here is the control to change to manual if you have the adapter. Film wind on and film rewind over here, and here we have the control for off and on, for checking the batteries, and to use the electronic self-timer. Opening the back is done in the usual way, so we just pull up on the rewind collar, and inside we can see the usual Olympus cloth shutter, which I think is probably derived from the Leica design. We'll wind on the film. It's reasonably noisy, but that is a feature of film SLRs. They do have quite noisy shutters because the mirror mechanism has to come up out of the way of the light path. There's a hot shoe on top of the camera. Unlike the OM1s and 2s, this hot shoe is actually built into the camera. It's not removable. It does, however, have removable focusing screens, so you can change screens. Now here's a little SLR that was definitely a consumer grade camera. These used to be sold by Dixons and Currys back in the day. This is the Cosina CT-1. These were a much cheaper alternative to the main manufacturers in their day, and they're still a cheap camera now. I've seen these cameras go for as little as £10 at car boot fairs, possibly even less. So what's the catch? Well, as the old adage goes, you get what you pay for. The Cosina is well made, but it's made mostly of plastic. It doesn't have the kudos or the cachet of the major manufacturers. But some would say there's no sense paying for a big name when you can get a small name that does much the same thing. And that's what the Cosina does, much the same thing as more expensive SLRs. There's a very wide range of lenses for this camera. The bodies and the lenses were made in Japan, which in the late 70s and early 80s was a byword for quality. I've found the lenses to be of very reasonable quality, although this 28mm that's on the camera now does have a sort of a bluish cast, which I'm not entirely keen on. But it is a fully featured SLR. This one is entirely manual, so it's very straightforward to use. Just wind the film on, and looking through the viewfinder you'll see a needle which is attached to the built-in light meter, so you adjust the shutter speeds and aperture to give you the correct amount of light. The other thing about these cameras is they're very small. Who wants to be hulking a huge SLR around with them all day? When it comes to cameras, smaller is always better, and that's an advantage of this one. Here is the top plate, standard layout, film advance lever, shutter release, shutter speed setting, which as you can see goes from 1000 to 1 and B. We've got a hot shoe on top, and we've got a film rewind lever over here together with the film speed setting, which runs from 25 to 1600, just like on the OM10. What you don't have on this camera is any exposure compensation, so there's no dedicated control to increase or decrease exposure in 1/3 stops. However, you don't really need that because you can compensate for exposure by just changing your aperture very slightly and sitting it just past the stop that you have selected. Here's the back of the camera, and to open it up, usual thing, pull up on the rewind crank. And when we open the camera up, well, there's something of a surprise, at least it was to me, because what we see here is a metal bladed shutter. The only other camera I know of that has that feature is the Nikon FM series, the various FM and FE cameras. In the Nikons it's made of titanium. In this camera I'm not sure what it's made of, but it's certainly nicely engineered, there's no doubt about that. So we just wind on nice and easily, and there goes the shutter. So these are nice little cameras, they're available very cheaply, and they're a great way to learn film photography. Here's another all-manual film SLR, which is available very cheaply. It's a very affordable machine. It's the Fujica STX-1N. I'm not quite sure why these cameras are as cheap as they are. They are made by the Fuji company of Japan, which has a very, very long association with photography, has been making cameras for many, many years. They're very nice quality, very well made, nicely engineered, and the lenses are some of the best you can get. This one's got a 1.9 on it, a 50mm 1.9. It's multi-coated, it's a great little lens, and indeed the camera itself is a nice piece of kit. It's not the smallest of these SLRs, but the difference in size between the OM series and these cameras is a matter of a millimetre here or there, so it doesn't really make a lot of difference. The top deck has the standard SLR layout, so we've got the film wind lever here, the shutter release button here, just where you'd expect to find it. We've got the shutter speed selector here, and if we pull up on that, that gives us the film speed selector, which on this camera runs from 50 again to 1600. The rewind crank is here, and the battery compartment, unusually, is here, right on the top deck. To open this camera, again, we use the standard SLR, pull up on the rewind crank, and when we open it up we see the Leica derived cloth shutter. Typical of SLRs, a fairly noisy shutter release, though don't forget these cameras are all sitting on a table which amplifies that noise. So in use they're not quite as noisy as you're hearing here. So there's the Fujica, a very nice little piece of kit, available for 20 quid or thereabouts with a lens. Do remember, if you're buying one of these, check the light meter. They can be a weak point on this model. Here's a camera that's gained iconic status. This is the Canon AE1. AE standing for automatic exposure. This camera dates, I think, from round about the early 80s and was a very early effort in automatic exposure. It's from a time when technology was changing and the market was changing, and manufacturers were finding ways to sell more cameras to more people and to encourage consumers away from the point and shoot variety of cameras towards SLRs. I will be doing a full review on this camera fairly soon, but for now let's have a quick walk around. Well, I mentioned this camera was auto exposure, and it is. However, it's not aperture priority, it's shutter priority. And I must admit, on first impression, I don't quite get it. Personally, as a photographer, I find aperture priority to be my default setting. It allows you to control depth of field in your image, and I can't think of a single situation where I've actually used shutter priority. Shutter priority, in case you're not sure, is where you set the shutter speed and the camera selects an appropriate aperture for you. So if you want shallow depth of field, or indeed deep depth of field, there's no guarantee that you're actually going to get it. However, shutter priority can be useful for things like freezing the movement of quick moving vehicles, say, or giving some motion blur. So this camera does give you some creative control. It's just a different kind of creative control. It's quite a hefty beast. It's certainly bulkier than the OM1s and 2s, and even a little more bulky than the OM10. The top plate, this area here, is made of plastic in this camera. So although it's not a cheap camera, in that respect it doesn't quite match the quality of the OMs or the Nikons. It's also very dependent on batteries. This is the battery door here on the front. It takes quite a large battery and the power drain is fairly high, so you do have to be careful to keep it turned off when you're not using it, or your battery won't last very long at all. Of course, one of the nicest things about Canon cameras is the lenses. Canon optics are second to none, and this camera has the 50mm 1.8 lens. Very, very nice optics. And if you have a modern Canon digital, these lenses, the FD series, will fit onto those cameras, and although you won't have any automation, you do have a nice vintage lens to shoot with. So again, we do have a fairly standard layout. We've got shutter speed dial here. We've got a film speed setting here, so this is a dual purpose control. Film advance, on-off switch and shutter release. Film rewind over here, and a hot shoe on top with its little cover, which doubles as a tool to open the battery cover on the front. And the rear of the camera is pretty much what you'd expect to find on a film SLR. We've got a little reminder for what film you're using here, so you slot the card in off your film on here. Most of the cameras here have this. To open the back, again, standard method, pull up on the rewind crank, and here we see the Leica derived cloth focal plane shutter, as many of these other cameras that we've looked at have. So to fire the camera, we turn on, advance the film, and the Canon does seem to be a little quieter than a lot of these other cameras, so that's a plus point. The Canon AE1 is, as I understand it, very often used by photography students, and that's entirely understandable because you do get automation and those fantastic Canon optics. A word of caution though, this camera has no manual mode at all. If the electronics fail, the camera will not fire, so any fault in the electronics is likely to render one useless. Try before you buy. Here's a camera that regular viewers of this channel will certainly have seen before. This is the Zenit E. This is a Russian-made SLR, and if you want basic, this is about as basic as it gets. There are no slow speeds on the camera. There's no hot shoe. The viewfinder is a very simple affair. There is no rangefinder built into the viewfinder that you often find on SLRs. There's no meter readout in the viewfinder. You have to look on the top deck here for the meter reading. The meter is selenium, which, although they can last, they're a fairly simple device, and as you can see, this one's sitting on top of the camera here rather than inside, giving through the lens metering. Shutter speeds run from 1/500th to 1/30th of a second and B. There are no slow speeds, and the whole thing, while it's substantial and heavy, doesn't feel as well made as really any of the other cameras here. They can be long lasting, they can stand the test of time, although the experience of using one is definitely not anything approaching a modern experience. This is a very simple camera, it's simply made, it does the job, but bells and whistles, there are none. All that said though, this camera has one great bonus, and that's this. Most of these cameras you will find for sale come with a Helios 44 or a 44-2. One of my favourite lenses, an exact copy of the 1930s Zeiss Biotar, and the one with the swirly bokeh, the swirl effect to out of focus areas in the shot, which personally I like very much. Here's the top deck. We've got a film counter here. We've got the shutter release here. We've got the rewind button here, which you have to press before rewinding the film to disengage the mechanism. And we've got the shutter speed dial on top here. This really is a very simple camera. The whole mechanism traces its lineage back to the very early Leicas from the late 20s. The shutter speeds are set in the same way. The range of shutter speeds is more or less the same. All of that makes for simplicity, but doesn't make for a particularly smooth or easy operation. Here is the readout for the meter needle, and here is the film speed setting. To open this camera, well, we lift this little latch on the side, and that reveals the Leica-derived focal plane cloth shutter. Now, remember when I said these cameras are simple and have stood the test of time? Well, this one hasn't. It's jammed and the shutter won't fire. Maybe this one's the exception that proves the rule. But I don't want to be too hard on the Zenits. When I was much younger, learning photography with my Fed 4 rangefinder, I would have given a lot to have owned one of these cameras, and they appeared to me at that time to be quite sophisticated. They are available extremely cheaply. I've seen them for £5 or so, and they do come with this fantastic lens, the Helios 44. So definitely don't discount the Zenit if you're looking for a film SLR. Now here's a camera that regular viewers to this channel will have seen before. This is the beautiful, jewel-like, tiny Olympus OM-1. The original OM camera. All manual exposure, no automation whatsoever on this camera. It, of course, mounts these fantastic, wonderful, jewel-like little lenses, the Zuiko lenses. Its construction is all of metal. There is, as far as I know, no plastic involved in any of the construction, apart from things like switches and so on. It's beautifully engineered, it's very small and compact, and it's reliable. A good OM1 will serve you for many years. The top deck of the single-digit OM cameras, the OM1, 2, 3 and 4, differ from the traditional SLR layout in that the shutter speed selector is here. It's mounted on the body right at the back of the lens, right behind the lens. This dial is not shutter speeds, this is for setting your film speed. Shutter release is here, film wind on is here, on-off switch as you can see is here, and the film rewind is here. The viewfinder on these cameras is one of the best you'll find in any film SLR. It's very big, it's very bright. There are interchangeable focusing screens. The one I've got in here at the moment has a central circle with micro prisms and a rangefinder right in the centre of the screen. It makes focusing very easy and quick. If we open up the camera, we will see a cloth focal plane shutter that many of these film SLRs have. Shutter sound is pretty much on a par with the rest of them. It's probably slightly on the more quiet side, but there's very little difference in it. Inside the viewfinder there is a simple needle, much like the one in the Cosina. And as you change your shutter speeds or apertures, the needle moves up and down until you find the correct exposure. Very simple, very effective. Here's the camera that came after the OM1. This is the OM2, and importantly the OM2, as well as being a fully manual camera, also has aperture priority auto exposure. I do like using aperture priority. I think it frees up the shooting experience. It allows you to concentrate on the image rather than worrying too much about which exposure you've set. It's a fairly early aperture priority system, so it's not always perfect. It does misread sometimes, but I'll forgive it that because it's such a lovely little thing. So this is essentially an OM1 with added aperture priority auto exposure. It runs on two little LR44 batteries. The batteries seem to last a long time, so unlike the Canon AE1, you won't constantly be worried about batteries running out or draining away. On the downside, aperture priority auto exposure adds complication and complexity. There's another element to go wrong. Having said that, I've handled quite a few of these cameras and they do seem to be reliable in that regard. Here's the top plate. It's pretty similar to the OM1 in its layout, so we've got the film advance lever here, we've got the shutter release here, just where you'd expect to find it. On this dial we've got exposure compensation by 2 stops either way in 1/3 of a stop steps, and we've got the film speed setting here. On this camera you just pull up to turn the setting to the right film speed. On the other side we've got the manual position for the switch, we've got off that it's set to now, we've got auto which sets it to aperture priority, and a further position to check the battery and make sure there's still enough juice in the battery. Just like the OM1, we've got the quirky shutter speed selector dial right next to the body, just behind the lens. Looking at the back of the camera, again it's very similar to the OM1. One thing I should mention is that these OM single-digit cameras have removable, interchangeable hot shoes. This one's got shoe 4 on it at the moment. Some of those shoes don't change between the OM1 and the OM2, and they do suffer a weakness in that if they get over-tightened, this is the screw that tightens them here, they can crack on this portion here and on the other side. Replacements are quite expensive, so do bear that in mind when buying. Opening the camera is done by the conventional method. Lift up, on the rewind crank, revealing the now familiar cloth focal plane shutter. To fire the camera, we'll switch it to auto and wind on. And there she goes. Again, a little more quiet than some of these cameras here. And finally, on our list of film SLRs, we have the Nikon FM. This was an all-manual camera, but there were later versions of essentially this same camera that had auto exposure in aperture priority mode. The engineering on the Nikon is exquisite. There's no other way to put it. It's incredibly well made. It's also really well designed. The chassis on this camera was used right up until the mid-90s, as I understand, on the various iterations of the F cameras. Make no mistake about it, this is a very well made camera that will last and last and last. It's all metal, there's no plastic at all used in its construction. All the bearings have ball races, there are no plain bearings in this camera. The main body casting is made of an alloy of copper and aluminium. It's so well made that there are stories of this camera, when used in war zones, having stopped bullets. That's how tough they are. There is probably no better made camera in the world. Here's a view of the top plate, a very conventional layout. Film advance, shutter release, film counter, and a combined control here to change the shutter speeds and to change the film speed. There's a hot shoe on top and a film rewind crank here. Camera's opened by the usual method of pulling up on the rewind crank here. There's a little catch you have to move to one side first, but I'm not going to open this one because I've got a roll of cine-still film in here which I'm going to be reviewing shortly, so we'll leave that closed so we don't lose all our shots. So, 8 film SLRs, some professional / semi-professional, some consumer grade, some with auto exposure, some fully manual. So which is best? Well, as always, it depends on what you want. These are my picks. So the winner of the category for Best Consumer Grade Film SLR is the Olympus OM-10. It's a beautiful little camera. It's small, it's light, it's well made. It has aperture priority auto exposure and it can do manual exposure with the adapter. It doesn't drain its batteries like the AE1, and best of all, it mounts these, the unparalleled Zuiko lenses. So that's my pick for this category, with the Cosina coming in second because it's available so cheaply. The winner of the category for Best Semi-Professional / Professional SLR with auto exposure is the Olympus OM-2. It's a lovely little machine. It mounts Zuiko lenses, it's beautifully engineered, it's small, and it has for me that all-important feature, aperture priority auto exposure. This is a very nice camera indeed. And finally, my pick for the best film SLR in either semi-professional / professional or consumer category is the Nikon FM. It's tremendously well made. It's simple to use. It's likely to last you as long as you want it to last. It mounts pretty much any Nikon lens that's ever been produced, apart from some of the later ones for the small sensor digital cameras. So there we are, 8 very nice film SLRs, all of which will give you good service, all of which will enable you to make some really nice images using nothing more than light and a piece of film. I hope you've enjoyed this video, I hope you found it useful. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time for more Zenography.